Alright, what's up everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Bonsai Jungle. On today's episode, I'm going to be making a forest planting which is based off of my favorite movie, Princess Mononoke. Now, Princess Mononoke is a film released by Hayao Miyazaki back in 1997. It's an animated film set in medieval Japan, and it deals with a girl raised by wolves and her forest getting cut down and the encroaching civilization destroying all the plants and animals there to build their village. Now, the plot is a little bit more complex than just man versus nature, but when I saw this film as a kid, I wanted to go run off and live with the animals instead of doing any kind of stupid job that society would tell me to do, and for the most part, I've achieved this goal. So today, in honor of all of the nostalgia of this movie, which I watched coincidentally kind of around the same time many years ago when I got into growing bonsai trees as well, I'm going to be showing you how exactly I designed this forest. So without further ado, let's get into the video. The main thing to talk about first is the stone slab. So I want this to look very natural, and we have this stone. It's kind of heavy, maybe around 35 pounds. And there is lichen that is growing in this upper left-hand corner from your perspective. And I picked this because I want this planting to look very natural, like it's in the wilderness on kind of a mountainside, rather than being in a container. Of course, I'm going with this idea of I don't want it to be civilized, I want it to be more wild. Even though it's entirely contrived and man-made, you know what I mean. Now, the other important part for this project is the plant selection. So I was thinking about what I should use for this, maybe Japanese white pine, maybe just make it all out of procumbens junipers. But I'm kind of limited to the species I can acquire and their size and how ready they would be for relatively finished, well along its way of becoming something that looks halfway decent rather than starting with little nursery stock material. So what I did was I had the idea that I'm going to make this all native plants. Wouldn't that be amazing? So I looked up where this movie had its forests based on, and it's this place called Yakushima in Japan. And the native species there that makes up a large part of the forest is the Japanese cedar or Cryptomeria. So I said, okay, I'm going to find a really nice Cryptomeria to be the centerpiece of this forest. Now, it's kind of difficult to do here in the United States. There really isn't a lot of nursery stock Cryptomeria, which I thought looked acceptable for this project. So I ended up ordering kind of a more refined specimen, but I'm going to refine it even further in this video. And then I did end up getting one of those nursery stock Cryptomerias, which has a thin trunk, but good enough for a forest because we can have a variety of trunk sizes. And of course, unstyled, so I'm going to have to take a look as to what I can do with this. I just ordered it offline, so I had no idea what kind of specimen is even going to be sent to me. So I got to work with what I have. Now, the other thing I bought were these Chinese elms. Not necessarily native to that region, but they look very wild. It's a cork bark elm, so the bark is really rough and old looking, and it had this moss growing on the branches. And just the whole shape of the tree itself looks kind of very, wild and unstyled. So even though I may refine it in the future, I want to kind of keep that aesthetic. So those are my trees. There's only 5 total, so maybe saying, well, 5 trees is kind of not enough for a forest, but it's an odd number, and I think it's going to be enough because this stone slab was so big when I originally purchased it. Now, when I kind of figured out which trees I want to use, it shrunk a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do today is cut back this tree and make it a little bit more refined. I have this kind of idea where I want it to look more like the famous Goshen forest created by John Naka. So I'm gonna have the foliage be cut into these little pads and like clouds throughout the trunk, trim it back a little bit more narrow and columnar rather than have this big canopy. So let's take it away with the video clips of pruning this tree. So here you can see the basic trimming that I'm doing today, pretty much just shaping these foliage pads so that it's not this big mound of foliage. I want to get some definition between each of these branches. So I'm cutting about half that foliage off just to compact all of the green growth, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all these small little branches that have sprouted close to the trunk just to expose the wood, and that gives it the effect of looking more like an older tree. Alright, so I'm about halfway through trimming this Cryptomeria, and I did a 50-50 comparison here so you can see the amount of work I'm doing on the tree today. It's not a whole lot. Basically, if you look at this side compared to this side, I'm just trimming back a third of the foliage to refine the foliage pads a little bit so it looks more like a tree rather than a bush. Cryptomeria is a vigorous growing tree, so it's easy for this to just become one big ball of foliage, not really the aesthetic that we're going for. So what I'm going to do is trim the rest of this tree to match this side, and I do want to go even further, and Cryptomeria is good at back budding on old wood, but since we're going to be going into the winter time, plus I am repotting this today and doing some work on the roots, I can't wire it or do very heavy pruning because number one, that's going to stress the tree out too much for one sitting, and then the other thing is I would have to trim the foliage back to the weaker interior growth, and that interior growth would have to wait through November, December, January, February until it can start pushing out new growth again. So it's going to be just sitting there in kind of a weaker state. It has a higher chance of becoming unhealthy. So for the interest of the tree, I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of work today and risk losing it rather than just having it repotted, having it refined a little bit, and then coming back later on to do the work. And basically if the tree dies on me, then the whole project is pointless. So I would rather wait, do it when the time is appropriate rather than making it look good for the video. So now that the process of trimming this tree is finished, the rest of today's work should be relatively easy. Of course, I don't want these trees growing in containers. I want them all planted as a single forest on that rock. So what I have to do is take all of these out of the pots. I'm going to scrape away a little bit of the soil and try and flatten out the root ball because I don't want this big mounded hill of stuff sitting on the rock. I'm going to flatten out as much as I can of this root ball. So what I'm going to do now is take my standard mix of equal parts akadama, pumice, and pine bark and get a layer of bonsai soil in the areas that I'm going to be planting these trees. So there's at least like a ½ an inch of new soil for the roots to grow down into. Then I'm going to look and see which position I want these trees in, and I'm going to tie the root ball to the rock with those wires. Those are, of course, the ones that I epoxied onto the stone. It's going to be pretty difficult to see the epoxy now that the trees are sitting right on top of that spot. And once we tighten these wires to keep the trees stable and attached to the rock, we're going to clip off the extra, and they're barely noticeable. So on this smaller rock, I have repeated the same process of placing down some bonsai soil, and then I'm wiring this Cryptomeria and that Chinese elm into place with some wires that are attached to the stone. And what I have here is called muck. It is a muddy substance made out of peat moss and clay dust, and I'm going to make a wall all around these roots. And what this is going to do is act almost like the edge of a pot, so it kind of helps keep everything held together. It is, of course, going to help all of the roots retain moisture because flat stone, it drains very easily. So this helps retain the moisture and protect the roots a little bit. And of course, like I said, it holds everything together. Here at the front, I left a little strip of that exposed rock so we can see that this is indeed a slab planting. And I'm just going to decide if I want the forest spirit on the right-hand side or the left-hand side. I think it looks better here on the left, although this right corner is also a possibility if I want him a little bit more hidden. Now, what you see here are the purple flowers on this plant that's called a creeping thyme. This is an Irish moss with white flowers, and there is a geranium here that's also a flowering plant. So right now I'm just placing these plants on the surface to get a rough idea of where I want them to sit. Then I'm going to come back, uncover the soil, and bury the roots into place once I decide the final positions. Here I wired a juniper on the right hand side of the stone, and that's pretty much all the plants that I'm using for the forest planting. Here is the final product. So that is my Princess Mononoke Bonsai Forest project for today. I really like how it turned out. There's a lot more work to be done. I need to wire some of these trees, especially this Cryptomeria at the very front, so that you can see more towards the background. I'm going to trim it back maybe half the size so it won't be such an eyesore at the very front of the planting. I'm going to wait for these Chinese elms to put on a lot more branches in the following growing season, and I'll also slowly work on this larger Cryptomeria, chop it back, and wire it up a little bit into a different position. But for a couple hours today, I threw this all together right now. I like how it turned out as just an initial project. And all the bottom foliage down here, all the mosses and ferns and little plants I put here are going to make a more solid carpet and kind of get into, their final shape and hold everything together and just look a little bit neater when it all grows over the next couple of months. So that's going to be it for today. I'm just going to wait for the plants to do their thing outside. Probably my favorite project I've ever worked on. This is the first time I've made a forest, and just with it being based on my favorite movie, all the little customizations that I've done, I really feel like it was my first bigger artistic adventure in bonsai. So, like I said, hope you enjoy. As always, good luck with your bonsai trees, and I'll see you in the next one.